What if the very thing you believe will make her fall in love with you is the exact reason she walks away? Sit with that question for a second, because by the end of the next 35 minutes, you will understand why so many good men, kind men, men who give everything they have, end up alone, confused, wondering what they did wrong. And the answer is not what you think. I want you to imagine a man, let's call him David, although he could be any of us. David meets a woman. He is captivated. He starts doing everything right, or at least everything he was taught was right. He drives 2 hours to see her after a 12-hour shift. He cancels plans with his friends because she needed to talk. He absorbs her bad moods, her silences, her tests, convinced that if he just endures long enough, if he just proves himself enough, she will finally see how much he loves her and reward him with the same devotion. Months pass. Then one day, without warning, she is gone. And David is left asking the question that brought you here tonight. Why does giving everything so often get you nothing back? Before I answer that, I have to tell you something, because it matters, and because I built it for exactly this moment in your life. Everything I am about to share with you tonight, the philosophy, the psychology, the uncomfortable truths, they come from years of study, failure, and rebuilding. I finally condensed all of it into a series of books on seduction, self-mastery, and the inner discipline that makes a man magnetic without him ever having to chase. They are already available, right now, linked in the description below this video. If what you hear tonight resonates with you even a little, that is where the deeper material lives, the frameworks I do not have time to fully unpack in 35 minutes. Go check the description. Now, back to David, and back to you. Here is the uncomfortable seed I want to plant in your mind before we go any further. Existence itself, according to the philosopher we are going to lean on heavily tonight, a 19th century thinker named Arthur Schopenhauer, is fundamentally a struggle. Not a punishment, not a curse, simply the base condition of being alive, wanting things, striving toward them, and rarely being satisfied, even when we get them. Schopenhauer believed that desire is an endless engine, and that the moment one want is fulfilled, another rises to take its place. Applied to how we chase love, chase approval, chase the feeling of being enough, this framework becomes almost frightening in its accuracy. Because so many of us are not actually pursuing a partner. We are pursuing relief from an internal ache that no partner was ever built to cure. Hold that thought. I am going to come back to it in a way that will genuinely surprise you, because the conclusion is not what most self-proclaimed gurus tell you. But first, let me ask you a second question, one that most men never bother asking themselves until it is far too late. When you imagine the version of yourself capable of holding a woman's attention effortlessly, capable of walking into a room and being remembered, what does that man actually do differently from you, right now, today? Not in some distant future where you have finally lost the weight, finally made the money, finally healed the wound. Today. If you cannot answer that question clearly, do not worry, because by the time this video ends, you will be able to. And that answer will unsettle you slightly, because it has almost nothing to do with tactics, and almost everything to do with a single internal shift most men actively avoid making because it requires giving something up first. Let's talk about sacrifice, because this is where most men get destroyed without ever realizing it happened. There is a quiet belief many of us carry, almost like a program running in the background of our minds, that says, the more I give, the more I will be loved. The more I bend, the more I will be chosen. The more I suffer for someone, the more they will finally understand my worth. It feels logical. It feels almost noble. And it is one of the most dangerous illusions a man can hold on to. Here is why. When sacrifice becomes a transaction, even a silent, unspoken one, it stops being generosity and becomes a debt you are quietly asking someone else to repay. And the moment another human being senses that debt, even subconsciously, something shifts. What should have felt like love starts to feel like pressure. What should have felt like devotion starts to feel like obligation. And obligation, my friend, has never once in the history of human connection generated desire. It generates guilt. It generates distance. Sometimes it generates resentment on both sides, his for not being appreciated, hers for being made to feel responsible for a debt she never agreed to. This is the trap David fell into. Every gesture, every sacrifice, was quietly, invisibly, a request. Notice me. Validate me. Prove that I matter. And the tragedy is that the more he asked, without ever saying a word, the less magnetic he became, because need repels the very thing it is chasing. Let me give you a second example, one that plays out almost identically in professional life, because this pattern is not confined to romance. Think about a coworker who constantly reminds you of favors they did, who cannot let a small act of kindness pass without mentioning it later, sometimes subtly, sometimes not so subtly. Even if what they did genuinely helped you, something about the reminder makes the gesture feel smaller, not larger. It stops being generosity in your memory and starts being a ledger entry. The same mechanism operates in love, except the stakes feel infinitely higher, because the currency being tracked is not a favor at work. It is the question of whether you are worthy of being chosen at all. There is a third version of this pattern, quieter still, that shows up not in grand gestures, but in tiny daily habits, the kind that feel harmless in isolation, but accumulate into the same trap over time. Always being the one who apologizes first, even when the disagreement was not entirely your fault. Always being the one who initiates contact after a fight, because silence feels unbearable. Always agreeing to plans you did not actually want, because saying no felt riskier than saying yes, and quietly resenting it later. None of these moments feel like sacrifice when they happen. Each one feels small, forgivable, even generous in the moment. But stacked together, week after week, they teach the other person, and more importantly, they teach you, that your preferences are negotiable, and theirs are not. That imbalance rarely announces itself loudly. It simply accumulates, quietly, until one day a man looks at the relationship he built and cannot quite explain why he feels so invisible inside it. Now stay with me, because this is where the video starts to shift into territory almost nobody talks about honestly. There is a discovery in neuroscience and behavioral psychology, one you may have never connected to relationships before, about how the human brain processes pleasure and discomfort. These two sensations are not separate systems. They sit on the same internal scale, like a seesaw balanced on a single point. When you experience something pleasurable, whether that is validation, attention, closeness, even just a text back from someone you like, the brain tips toward pleasure. But almost immediately, it begins correcting itself, pulling the seesaw back toward the other side, toward discomfort, to restore balance. This is not a flaw. It is how the reward system was designed to keep you from getting stuck in permanent bliss or permanent despair. Here is what almost nobody tells you. Chasing external validation, whether from a person, a phone screen, or an audience, keeps that seesaw permanently tilted toward artificial highs, which means the correction toward the low side becomes stronger and more frequent over time. This is precisely why men who orient their entire identity around being desired by someone else end up feeling worse the harder they try, not better. Every unanswered message, every cooled interaction, every perceived rejection lands harder because the system is already primed for collapse. The way out is almost the opposite of what instinct tells you to do. Instead of endlessly chasing the pleasure side of that scale by seeking approval, you deliberately walk toward the discomfort side first. Discipline, solitude, physical training, delayed gratification, doing hard things nobody applauds you for. This sounds like punishment, but it is not. It is recalibration. When you willingly tip the scale toward difficulty on your own terms, the mind naturally swings back toward genuine satisfaction, the kind that does not evaporate the second someone stops replying to your texts. I need you to pause here, mentally, and ask yourself an honest question. When was the last time you did something difficult purely because it made you stronger, not because you were trying to impress anyone? If the answer makes you uncomfortable, good. That discomfort is exactly where we are heading next. There is a companion piece to this internal scale that almost nobody mentions, and it might be the single most important detail in tonight's entire video. The scale does not just react to pleasure and discomfort you experience directly. It reacts to pleasure and discomfort you merely anticipate. This is why a single unanswered message can spiral a man into hours of anxious rumination. His mind is not reacting to the silence itself. It is reacting to an imagined future built entirely out of that silence. A future where he has already been rejected, already been humiliated, already lost something he never even had a firm grip on to begin with. Understanding this single mechanism, that most of your suffering around uncertainty is manufactured internally rather than delivered externally, is close to a superpower once it is fully absorbed. It means the real contest was never really out there, with her, with circumstance, with timing. It was always here, inside the architecture of your own anticipation. Before we continue, I want to ask you for something small but meaningful to me personally. If this framework is already reshaping how you see your own patterns, hit the subscribe button and become part of this community. I read every comment. I build this channel around the men who show up consistently, and I would genuinely love to have you as one of them going forward. It costs nothing, and it means everything to how far these ideas travel. Now, let's talk about the difference between being pitied and being respected, because this distinction changes everything about how attraction actually functions. Somewhere along the way, many men were taught, whether by movies, by well-meaning parents, or by a culture obsessed with vulnerability as the ultimate virtue, that if you simply expose your pain, someone will rush in to comfort you, and that comfort will turn into love. Vulnerability absolutely has its place, and emotional honesty is not weakness. But there is a version of exposing your pain that is not honesty at all. It is a quiet plea for rescue. And people, whether consciously or not, can feel the difference between a man who shares a struggle from a place of strength and a man who displays a struggle hoping someone else will carry it for him. The first version draws people closer. The second, almost without exception, pushes them away, even when they feel guilty about it, even when they cannot explain why. Respect is earned differently than sympathy. Sympathy is given to someone who appears fragile. Respect is given to someone who demonstrates, through consistent action rather than announcement, that he can carry weight without being crushed by it. Here is the paradox at the center of tonight's video. The moment you stop performing your suffering for an audience, whether that audience is one person or the entire internet, and instead start quietly transmuting that suffering into discipline, into skill, into purpose, you become someone entirely different to be around. Not because you suppressed your pain, but because you stopped asking other people to manage it for you. I want to tell you about a client I worked with. I will call him Marcus, because his story illustrates this almost perfectly. Marcus came to me convinced that if he could just show a particular woman how much he had sacrificed for her, cancelled trips, lent money, absorbed insults he should never have tolerated, she would eventually reciprocate with the same intensity. Instead, the more he revealed his suffering, the colder she became. It was not because she was cruel. It was because every disclosure functioned as an invisible invoice, and nobody, no matter how much they care, wants to feel like a debt collector's target, disguised as a romantic partner. What changed things for Marcus was almost embarrassingly simple to describe, though brutally hard to execute. He stopped narrating his sacrifices. He stopped explaining how much he gave. He simply gave less, redirected that energy into his own goals, his own body, his own unfinished projects, and let his actions, not his explanations, speak for the man he was becoming. Within weeks, without him orchestrating a single manipulative move, the entire dynamic between them shifted. Not because he tricked her, but because he stopped presenting himself as someone waiting to be rescued and started presenting himself as someone building something worth being part of. But here is the part of Marcus's story that surprised even me, and I want to be transparent about it, rather than tidy it up for the sake of a cleaner narrative. Marcus did not feel triumphant during that period. He felt strange, almost hollow at first, because the identity he had built around being the devoted, self-sacrificing man had quietly become his entire personality. Removing it left a gap, and for a few uncomfortable weeks, he was not sure what belonged in that space instead. This is something almost nobody warns you about when they describe transformation. It is rarely a straight line from weak to strong. There is often a strange, disorienting middle stretch where the old identity has been dismantled, but the new one has not fully solidified yet. If you ever find yourself there, and many of you watching tonight already are, Understand that the discomfort is not evidence that something has gone wrong. It is evidence that something old is finally being cleared out to make room. There is a reason this particular pattern, giving in hopes of receiving, repeats itself across an enormous number of men, almost like a script written before any of us were born. Somewhere early in life, many of us learned that love had to be earned through usefulness. Perhaps a parent's attention only arrived when we achieved something or behaved a certain way. Perhaps affection in our household always came with quiet conditions attached. Whatever the origin, the result is the same. An adult man who unconsciously believes that being loved requires constant proof, constant performance, constant sacrifice. Because somewhere along the way, unconditional worth was never modeled for him. Recognizing this pattern in yourself, if it applies, is not an excuse to stay stuck in it. It is the first and most necessary step toward finally rewriting it. This brings us to the forge, an image I return to constantly because it captures something words alone struggle to convey. Picture raw iron ore. On its own, it is brittle, shapeless, unremarkable. It becomes steel only when it is placed into fire, heated until it glows, and then struck, again and again, under controlled, deliberate pressure. Remove the fire too early, and the metal stays soft and useless. Apply pressure without heat, and it simply shatters. But combine both, correctly, patiently, and something unbreakable emerges. Suffering, on its own, does not make a man stronger. Plenty of men suffer their entire lives and remain exactly as brittle as they started. What transforms suffering into strength is the deliberate act of shaping it, applying discipline to it, refusing to let it remain formless pain, and instead striking it, again and again, into something with structure, direction, purpose. This is the difference between a man who has simply endured hardship and a man who has been forged by it. Here is where I want to challenge something you might be quietly telling yourself right now. You might be thinking, fine, I understand the forge, I understand discipline, but does becoming this kind of man actually change how women respond to me? Or is this just self-improvement wrapped in nicer language? I want to give you an honest answer, not a flattering one. Attraction, at its core, tends to respond to demonstrated capability far more reliably than it responds to declared feelings. A man who says I would do anything for you carries far less weight than a man whose daily life visibly reflects discipline, direction, and self-respect, even when love is never mentioned at all. This is not manipulation, it is simply how presence works. People generally are drawn towards stability, not because stability is exciting in the moment, but because instability, however romantic it may feel briefly, is exhausting to build a life around. A man who has done the internal work of not needing external approval to function tends to radiate a kind of calm that is genuinely rare, and rarity, in almost every domain of human interest, generates value. But I need to say something clearly, because I do not want tonight's message twisted into something it was never meant to be. None of this is a strategy for controlling another person, and it should never be treated as one. This is not a manual for tricking someone into affection they would not otherwise choose to give. It is a description of what tends to happen, almost as a side effect, when a man stops outsourcing his sense of worth to someone else's opinion of him. The goal was never to manufacture her admiration. The goal is to become a man whose life stands solidly enough that her admiration, if it comes, is simply a welcome addition rather than the entire foundation. Let me pull on this thread a little further, because there is a question hiding underneath everything we have discussed so far that deserves a direct answer. If this is not about tricking anyone, then why does it work at all? The honest answer lies in something almost embarrassingly simple once you see it clearly. People are drawn toward energy that is already complete, and they tend to drift away from energy that is visibly searching for completion elsewhere. This is not unique to romance. Watch how a room responds to someone who walks in fully at ease with themselves, needing nothing from anyone present, versus someone who walks in scanning every face for approval. The first person barely has to try. The second person could say all the right words and still leave the room feeling slightly less compelling than they intended. Presence, in its truest form, is simply the absence of visible need. And visible need, no matter how well disguised behind charm or generosity or clever words, is almost always detectable, because human beings have spent hundreds of thousands of years developing an instinct for reading exactly this kind of signal in one another. Let's shift now to a concept that changed the way I personally think about growth, something psychologists call the power of not yet. There was a study conducted with children around 10 years old, given problems deliberately designed to be slightly beyond their current skill level. As you would expect, most of them struggled. But something fascinating happened in how different children interpreted that struggle. One group treated failure as proof that they were simply not smart enough, that their abilities were fixed traits they either had or did not have, and they became discouraged, some to the point of giving up entirely. Another group responded in an almost opposite way. They found the difficulty energizing, treating the problem not as a verdict on their worth but as evidence that they had simply not developed the skill yet. That single word, yet, changes everything about how a man interprets his own romantic and personal setbacks. I am not good with women yet. I do not yet have the discipline I am building toward. I have not yet become the version of myself I am working to construct. This reframing is not delusion. It is not pretending failure did not happen. It is refusing to let a single moment in time define a trajectory that is still being written. Here is something almost nobody tells you about talent, and it applies directly to what we have been discussing. Yes, some men seem to have a natural ease with charm, with presence, with confidence. But natural ease is rarely as natural as it appears from the outside. Almost every man who radiates effortless confidence today paid for it, earlier, in some form of discomfort you never witnessed, rejections absorbed quietly, awkward years nobody filmed, failures processed alone, without an audience, without applause. What you are seeing now is the finished steel, not the fire it was forged in. Before we move forward, I want to make sure you never lose this video in your feed, because there is a real chance you will need to come back to parts of it later, once life tests whether you actually absorbed it or just watched it. Tap the notification bell on this channel right now. This is different from subscribing. Subscribing tells the platform you want to be part of this community. The bell tells it to actually notify you the moment a new video drops, instead of quietly burying it somewhere you will never scroll far enough to find. Most men who say they follow a channel never actually see half of what gets posted, simply because the bell was never activated. Do not let that be you tonight. There is a second layer to the power of not yet, that most people who quote this idea online never bother explaining, and it is the part that actually matters most. It is not enough to simply attach the word yet to a failure and feel better temporarily. The word only has power when it is backed by a concrete plan, something specific you are actually doing to close the gap between where you are and where you are aiming. I am not good with women yet, followed by nothing, is just a softer form of denial. I am not good with women yet, followed by a deliberate decision to study your own patterns, seek honest feedback, practice in low-stakes situations, and track what actually changes your results. That is the version with teeth. The word yet is not a comfort blanket. It is a promissory note, and like any promissory note, it only holds value if you actually intend to pay it. I want to pause here and ask you to genuinely reflect, not just nod along. Where in your own life have you quietly decided that you are simply not that kind of man, when the more honest sentence would be that you are not that kind of man yet? Sit with that discomfort for a moment, because growth almost never arrives disguised as comfort. It almost always arrives disguised as friction. Now, before we move into the final and most important part of tonight's message, I want to ask you for something else, quickly, because it genuinely helps this message reach more men who need to hear it exactly the way you needed to hear it tonight. If any part of what you have heard so far has struck something in you, tap the like button right now. It takes less than a second, and it directly determines whether this video reaches someone else out there tonight who is sitting exactly where David was, exactly where Marcus was, exactly where you might have been not long ago. Let's talk about identity, because everything we have discussed collapses without this final piece. A man who builds his entire sense of purpose around being chosen by someone else is standing on a foundation that was never his to control in the first place. Her mood, her attention, her interest. None of these are things you can command into existence through effort alone, no matter how disciplined you become. This is precisely why the deepest version of this work is not actually about becoming irresistible to any particular woman. It is about becoming a man whose stability does not depend on the outcome of that pursuit at all. This does not mean withdrawing from connection, becoming cold, or pretending you do not want love, closeness, or partnership. Wanting those things is human, and denying that would be its own kind of dishonesty. What it means is refusing to let the presence or absence of those things determine your internal state, purpose, discipline, physical health, meaningful work, a life built with intention rather than default. These become the ground you stand on, whether or not any particular relationship succeeds. When that ground is solid, romantic outcomes stop feeling like verdicts on your value and start feeling like information, useful, sometimes painful, but never existential. I want to give you something practical here, because philosophy without application tends to evaporate the moment the video ends and daily life resumes. Start by auditing where your identity currently lives. Ask yourself honestly, if a particular relationship ended tomorrow, what would remain of who you are? If the answer is uncomfortably thin, that is not a life sentence. It is simply a diagnosis, and diagnoses can be treated. Begin rebuilding deliberately. Pick one skill you have postponed and give it a fixed number of hours each week, no exceptions. Pick one physical practice and commit to it, regardless of motivation, because motivation is unreliable and discipline is not. Pick one area of knowledge you have always wanted to master and start today, not when circumstances feel more convenient, because circumstances rarely do. None of this needs to be dramatic. It needs to be consistent, because consistency, quietly repeated over months, is what actually reshapes a man's internal architecture, not a single motivated weekend that fizzles out by Wednesday. There is also a quieter, more uncomfortable form of discipline worth naming directly: the discipline of tolerating uncertainty without immediately reaching for relief. Every time you resist the urge to check whether she replied, every time you sit with the discomfort of not knowing instead of numbing it with a distraction, you are training a muscle that almost nobody else around you is training. This is not stoicism for its own sake. It is the deliberate practice of proving to your own nervous system that uncertainty will not destroy you, that you can hold tension without collapsing into either anxious pursuit or bitter withdrawal. Over time, this single skill, more than any line, any tactic, any clever piece of advice you could memorize, is what separates men who remain calm under pressure from men who fall apart the moment a situation stops going according to plan. I want to give you a way to actually practice this, because knowing about a muscle is not the same as training it. The next time you feel the pull to check a phone, to reread an old conversation, to seek any small hit of reassurance about where you stand with someone, do not suppress the urge and pretend it is not there. That rarely works for long. Instead, name it out loud or in your head, exactly as it is. This is the urge for relief. I do not need to act on it right now. Then give yourself a fixed, short window, 5 minutes is enough to start, where you simply let the discomfort exist without feeding it. You will notice something almost every time you do this honestly. The urge peaks, and then it fades, on its own, without you needing to resolve it externally at all. Repeat this enough times, in enough situations, and something remarkable happens. Uncertainty stops feeling like an emergency. It starts feeling like weather, something that passes through you rather than something that defines you. I want to bring this back to Schopenhauer for a moment, because there is a nuance in his philosophy that most people who quote him online completely miss. Yes, he believed existence involves inevitable suffering, but he also believed that a kind of peace becomes available once a person stops endlessly grasping for satisfaction from external sources and instead finds a quieter, more internal form of contentment, one rooted in understanding rather than acquisition. Applied here, the lesson is not that women are obstacles to be conquered or opponents to be defeated in some invisible contest. The lesson is that peace was never something another person was ever going to hand you in the first place. It had to be built, internally, by you, regardless of who walks in or out of your life. This is also where I want to be honest about the limits of everything we have discussed tonight. It would be easy, and frankly a little seductive, to walk away from this video believing that women, as a category, behave according to some fixed formula, that they universally crave a man who suffers, or universally test men in identical ways, or universally respond to any single script. That would be an oversimplification, and I would be doing you a disservice if I let you leave here believing it. What we have actually been discussing is not a manipulation manual aimed at another person. It is a philosophy of self-construction that happens to produce, as a natural consequence, the kind of man people generally find magnetic, not because he learned to perform confidence, but because he stopped needing anyone's permission to possess it. There is one more thing I need to say clearly, because it is the difference between this message landing as wisdom versus landing as bitterness. None of this should ever curdle into resentment toward women as a group. If tonight's video leaves you angrier at the world rather than more anchored within yourself, something has gone wrong, and I would rather you walk away from this channel entirely than walk away carrying that. The goal was never to build walls. The goal was to build a foundation solid enough that walls become unnecessary. I have seen this go wrong before, and I want to name it honestly so you can recognize it if it starts happening in your own thinking. Some men hear a message like tonight's and quietly translate it into something bitter, a private belief that women in general cannot be trusted, that vulnerability is always a liability, that the safest posture is permanent guardedness dressed up as strength. That is not strength. That is fear wearing a costume borrowed from strength, and it tends to produce men who are technically unbothered, but functionally isolated, mistaking numbness for peace. Real solidity does not require you to stop caring. It simply means your caring no longer comes from a place of desperation. You can still be warm. You can still be generous. You can still fall deeply for someone. The difference is that none of it is happening because you need it to happen in order to feel like a whole person. It is also worth saying plainly that not every woman behaves according to a single script, and treating half the population as a predictable puzzle to be solved is, frankly, a lazy substitute for actually understanding another human being. What tonight's message offers is not a universal formula for decoding women. It is a description of what tends to happen internally within a man once he stops needing anyone's approval to feel complete, and how that internal shift tends to be noticed, appreciated, and responded to by the people around him, romantic or otherwise. The distinction matters, because one version of this message builds a man capable of genuine connection, and the other version simply builds a more sophisticated form of resentment. Let's return, finally, to David, because I think you deserve to know how his story continued. He did not get the woman back. That is not the ending I am giving you tonight, because it would be a lie, and this channel does not deal in comfortable lies. What actually happened is more interesting. In the months that followed, without trying to prove anything to anyone, he rebuilt his mornings around discipline, instead of anxious waiting for a reply that might never come. He returned to a physical practice he had abandoned years earlier. He picked up a skill he had always wanted to learn and had always postponed because he was too busy managing someone else's emotional weather. Slowly, without announcing it, without performing it for an audience, he became a different man, not because a woman finally noticed him, but because he stopped needing her to. I asked David once, months later, whether he regretted the relationship, whether he wished he had never given so much of himself to someone who ultimately left. His answer stayed with me, and I think it belongs here, at the heart of tonight's message. He said the relationship was not the mistake. The mistake was believing that his worth was ever something she was capable of granting or withholding in the first place. Once he understood that distinction, fully, not just intellectually but in the way a man understands something after living through it, the pain did not disappear overnight, but it stopped being able to define him. That is the entire difference between a wound that controls a man for years and a wound that simply becomes part of his history. And here is the twist that tends to happen more often than people expect, though I want to be careful not to promise it as a guaranteed outcome, because it is not. Other people did start noticing him. Not because he changed his strategy toward them, but because he had genuinely changed, in ways that were not designed to be noticed at all. That is usually how it works. The version of magnetism built on genuine internal solidity tends to outlast, by a wide margin, the version built on performance, because performance requires an audience, and solidity requires only you. If you have made it all the way to this point in the video, I want you to do something for me, and I mean this sincerely, not as a gimmick. Comment the words "I am here" below this video. I read every single one, and I will personally respond to you myself. Not an assistant, not a template, me. Making it this far, staying present for 35 minutes of dense material, instead of scrolling away to the next distraction, already tells me something about the kind of man you are becoming, even if you cannot fully see it yet. And if what you heard tonight genuinely resonated with something inside you, if some part of this felt less like content and more like a mirror, subscribe to this channel and become part of what we are building here. Hit like as well, because this small action decides, more than anything else, whether the next man who needs exactly this message, at exactly the right moment in his life, actually finds it. One last thing before you go, because I want to make sure you do not miss it. The books I mentioned at the beginning of tonight's video, covering seduction, discipline, and the deeper psychology behind everything we explored together, are available right now, linked in the description below. If tonight's video gave you a taste of how these ideas can reshape the way you move through the world, those books go far deeper than 35 minutes ever could. Go check the description, take the next step, and I will see you in the next one.